Good afternoon, everyone. We'll just wait a few minutes more to welcome attendees to this webinar. Hi, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Meryl de Myank. I am a research fellow at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism. For those of you that are not familiar with ICCT yet, our organization is an independent think and do tank based in The Hague in the Netherlands. And we're working to produce evidence-based research, policy advice, as well as concrete on-the-ground solutions in the field of counterterrorism, using a human rights and rule of law-based approach. We are present in various geographical areas, but a lot of our work in recent years has notably focused on West Africa and the Sahel region. So I'm very glad to be able to host this live briefing today on lessons from decade-long counterterrorism efforts in the Sahel. As many of you might already know, the January 2023 marks the 10th anniversary of the launch of the first French Operation Serval in Mali, which aimed at countering terrorist groups' presence in northern regions of the country, and which was closely followed by the Operation Barkhane deployed throughout the broader Sahel. A decade later, we see that the region is still faced with the presence of various non-state armed groups, including Al-Qaeda and Islamic State affiliated organizations. According to the Global Terrorism Index, the region now accounts for more than a third of terrorism-related deaths globally. And alongside this security situation, the Sahel has also been faced with political instability, notably illustrated by the series of coups that have happened in recent years, as well as seems to become a major stage for a global competition, global powers rivalries. So we're going to discuss these and many others related issues today during this webinar. And for that, we have the chance to welcome a very distinguished panel of experts. So let me just quickly introduce you to our speakers today. We're going to start with Richard Appel. Richard is a cybersecurity expert and data management and analysis professional with over 10 years experience researching, teaching, consulting. He currently works as a systems analyst for the African Union Commission at the Africa Center for the Study and Research on Terrorism. And he's a visiting fellow at the Human Security Research Center, Ghana. His research interests include countering terrorist exploitation of ICTs and emerging technologies, cybersecurity and resilience, digital forensic investigation, and the role of youth in preventing violent extremism. Today, Richard will discuss the efforts that have been deployed throughout the region to counter violent extremism, particularly national and regional initiatives, and provide us with data on the evolution of the situation, the main challenges, and some recommendations on the way forward as well. We will then have the chance to listen to Delina Gojo, who's an independent security analyst working for a number of European foundations and civil society organizations. She is an associate fellow at the Egmont Institute, as well as a PhD candidate at Scuola Normale Superiore and Scuola Sant'Anna in Italy. Her research and advocacy interests include remote warfare and security, and her geographic focuses are Europe and West Africa. Delina will discuss European and international interventions to counter extremism in the Sahel, and more particularly the situation in Niger, where she is joining us from. And finally, Andrew Lebovich. Andrew is a research fellow at the Klingendahl Institute's Conflict Research Unit. He was formerly a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and he's completing a PhD in African history at Columbia University in the city of New York, where his dissertation focuses on Muslim reformist movements in Algeria, Mali, and Senegal in the 20th century. He has studied armed groups, politics, religious movements, and conflict dynamics in North Africa and the Sahel. And he has lived and conducted field research in a number of countries, including Morocco, Algeria, Mali, Senegal, and Niger. He will conclude this series of presentation with a discussion on recent trends in the region, and especially the emergence of new security actors onto the Sahel scene. There will be a Q&A session at the end of this live briefing, so I encourage all of the participants to submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will try to address as many as we can at the end of this event. Also wanted to mention that you're going to be redirected to a post-event survey at the very end of the webinar. So please take just a few minutes to answer that. That would be really helpful for us. Without further ado, I think I'm going to just stop here and pass on the floor to our very first speaker. So please, Richard, you can start.
Okay, Mary, thank you very much. I hope my voice is audible enough to be heard.
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay, thank you very much. So, as mentioned, I think that the profile is already mentioned, and I would want to first of all say a very thank you to the ICCT for putting the webinar together for our learning and that of our colleagues that are joining from various parts of the world. I'm currently in Ghana, so it's a good afternoon from here. I'm sure it's a good morning and good evening to other people. So I think the slides can move on. So this afternoon, I would be presenting to us some of the national and the regional initiatives to counter terrorism in the Sahel. We'll look at some of the critical review of the threats and responses that have evolved over the period of time. As you mentioned, this year, or let's say last year, formed 10 years of extreme counterterrorism in the Sahel, mainly by foreign actors that have been in the Sahel for a very long time. And so we try to look at their efforts and as to how that has contributed to stabilizing the Sahel region as a whole. Please move to the next slides. So by way of agenda, I will just look at a brief introduction. We will look at how the situation is as violent extremism in the Sahel, what has been the critical threats, what has been the national response, the countries that are currently in the storm of the eye of violent extremism and terrorism in the Sahel. Have they looked on unconcerned? What have been their efforts? The region as a whole, the ECOWAS, the AU, and then other regional initiatives. All these initiatives, we also look at what have been the challenges, and then I will end the presentation with what more we could do to stabilize the situation if it is not stabilized. Please, next slide. Next. So currently, when we look at what is happening in the Sahel, obviously, you cannot definitely talk about violent extremism and terrorism in the global world without mentioning the Sahel. especially those of us in Africa, we have noticed that areas such as the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, the Great Lakes region, and the Lake Chad Basin are the hotspots of terrorism in Africa, but in particular, the Sahel, because of course, the Sahel has become one of the danger zones. If you look at areas where we call it Tago Goma area, which is the tri-border area between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, you will notice that a lot of violent extremist groups, such as the Islamic State in Greater Sahel, we are looking at the group for the support of Islam and Muslim, which in English we call them the Jenim. We are looking at Ansarul Salam, and then we can also look at Boko Haram and its offspring, ISWAP, which operates in parts of Niger. So all this group and multitude of other smaller splinter groups continue to operate in the Sahel that continue to make the Sahel a hotspot of terrorism and violent extremism. Indeed, if any of us have followed the trajectory, we would notice that over the past years, especially in 2022, there has been some resurgence of terrorist and violent extremism activities in the Sahel. And this is actually happening as a result of multiple factors. One, the Western Sahel part of the Sahel this year and last year has witnessed a number of unconstitutional changes of government, which in itself has affected the trajectory of peace and security in the area. And so these resurgence now coming on board with other factors are even threatening coastal states of West Africa that share borders with Sahel countries. Here we are talking about countries like Ghana, we are talking about Benin, we are talking about Togo, we are talking about Cote d'Ivoire. You will notice that with the exception of Ghana, all these three countries that I mentioned in the year 2022 have witnessed some attacks from groups that are originally operating in the Sahel. This presupposes that the threat from the Sahel are now spilling over to other parts of the region and therefore threatening peace and security in the area. Please, we can move on to the next slide, 2 slides. Yes, next. Now, we cannot talk about the dynamics of violent extremism and the terrorism in the Sahel without giving some historical perspective. How did this whole situation evolve in the Sahel? Indeed, countries of the Sahel region might be having some issues of peace and security. But of course, if you look at the trajectory, these whole issues of violent extremism and terrorism began somewhere in 2012, given the fallout of the Libya and the arms proliferation that happened in Libya and its effect on the Sahel. In 2012, we have what we call the Tuareg rebellion in northern part of Mali, where some group of people decided that they want independence for their state. And so from there, they mobilized arms. And given that some of them have been participated in the Libya fallout, arms proliferation became much more in the Sahel. So this uprising even led to the overthrow of some constitutionally elected regime in Mali, from what we call the Amadou Touareg government. From there, immediately the military takeover happened. Rebels groups intensified their activities, and security in the northern Mali began to have a nosedive. Here, terrorist groups took over areas such as Kidal, Gao, and Timbuktu. The French Operation Savannah, having realized the harm these rebel groups were causing to northern part of Mali and where it was spreading into central part of Mali, decided to intervene. And the main purpose of the Savannah, which we are celebrating the 10 years today, was to stabilize northern Mali and prevent it from spreading to the central part of Mali and even coming to the capital. Now, by 2023, Savannah tried to stabilize the situation. There was a return of constitutional order in 2023, but that actually could not sustain the situation. Then we move on into 2024, where now, having achieved some success with the server, they decided that they will launch what we call the Operation Bakan. So Operation Barkhane came to replace Operation Savannah in 2014. And in 2015, we decided that we would sign what we call the OGS Peace Accord to ensure that these rebel groups that are trying to fight for independence in Mali are brought to the table to ensure peace and security in the Mali. That, again, has its own limitations, and the challenges continued. And when Barkhane indeed increased its activities in Mali, the smaller terrorist groups that were operating in splinter decided to come together. So in 2017, a major incident happened where all the splinter groups decided to come together to form what we call the Group for Support of Islam and Muslim, which we call the JNIM. The JNIM main agenda was to fight the military intervention that was happening in the Sahel. Then, throughout the process, Barkhane continued to fight and do counter-terrorism operation there in Mali. At that point, there was a spread over of the attacks all over parts of Mali and even going to Burkina Faso and Niger, and other countries began to suffer. Then in 2020, some other European countries decided to join the Operation Barkhane, and then they came onto the scene, what we call the Takuba Task Forces, to help with counterterrorism in the Sahel. We all know what has happened due to political issues, coup d'etats, and severe political diplomatic relations. In 2022, the withdrawal of these forces had to leave Mali for good. Please move on to the next slides. So I just want to use this map to demonstrate how the attack has happened and how the evolution has been. If you look at this map, this is the Sahel area in 2012, when this whole activities of violent extremism evolved. In 2012, you will notice that the attacks are mainly in part of the northern and central parts of Mali, with just a pocket of it that you can find even in Niger. But what happened in 2017? The next slide shows us that in 2017, the attacks have now begun to spread into parts of Burkina Faso, the border part of Burkina Faso where it shares with Mali. And then Niger has also begun to experience a lot of the attacks, especially into the Lake Chad Basin part of the Niger. And then what do we see in 2021? In last year, you could see that attacks have spread all over, all the countries. And you could see that Burkina Faso gradually has become also a center of terrorist attacks, and multitude of terrorist groups are currently operating in Burkina Faso. So the map in 2021 actually shows us that the attack have now spread even beyond the Sahel countries, and some of the coastal states like Cote d'Ivoire, Togo, Benin have experienced attacks in magnitude. And the Lake Chad Basin side of Niger also continue to experience attacks. And the point is that if measures and the required attention are not put in place, we will notice that how the spread has been in the Sahel will continue in the coastal states, and the stress will be more on us. Please, let's move on to the next slide. So here is about a quantitative data of the last 5 years, how the attacks have been. If you look at the 2017 data, you realize that in 2017 and 2018 and 2019 especially, the attack peaked. And then the attacks began to decline in 2020, 2021, and then the 2022 data is there. However, if I had to show the deaths per year, you would notice that the 2022 and 2021s, where we're even experiencing less attack, the deaths in terms of casualties were even more. Here, the implication is that the terrorist groups have become more brutal and they have become more lethal. And so they are able to launch and plan the attack, and they are able to hit their target. And their primary target of attack, if you look at the modus operandi of the groups, have been on the security forces, sometimes civilians, critical infrastructure, military equipment, and even government officials. So really, all these periods where the attacks keep either going up or decreasing, the counter-terrorism forces have been in place in the country. One cannot say success have not been achieved, but as the presentation go on, we may want to know whether something more needs to be done and what was not done right in the process. Please, next slide. So, if all these things are happening, you can ask yourself, what exactly is continuing to allowing this sustaining momentum? You can click on the slides again, the picture will come. You will ask, what has been the sustaining momentum? Look, not a single factor could be blamed for what is happening in the Sahel. Multitude of factors. This include internal factors. This include some grievances. This include external factors that continue to hamper on the development of violent extremism and terrorism in the Sahel. And so there was something I call from hope to violence. And that actually demonstrates the evolutions of violent extremism from a situation of hope where people have to decide that they will not respect the rules of their country again, and then they would want to take arms to fight against the norms of the society. Next slide, please. Yes, next. Now, I have studied the conditions in the Sahel, and I would say that I can put the condition into three broad areas as the main causal factors that continue to evolve the terrorism and violent extremism in the Sahel. First of all, I look at what we call the structural economic conditions of countries in the Sahel. What we have to know is that majority of the Sahel countries economically are disadvantaged. And this is basic in their structural economic condition. And this is something that we cannot be able to blame the Sahel countries for that, because these are inherent economic characteristics. And these ones contribute to a lot of the societal problems that the countries continue to face, including the ability to provide the basic necessities of people in the areas. And because of that, these issues make the population vulnerable to the extremist groups. And so the extremist groups begin to use these avenues as a means of recruitment to continue to recruit people into their ranks. Some other factors also include religious extremism. There are people who feel that they have to take religion as a means of trying to cause mayhem, where other people have to force to join one religion or the other. These issues are all happening within the Sahel countries and continue to actually affect them. Next slide. Yes, we can move on to the next. These are just strategies. Now, we cannot say that nothing has not been done. In fact, I, for one, have said that, yes, the intervention from Sevar to Bakan to others actually degraded the capacities of violent extremist group in the Sahel in a lot of ways. In fact, their capacities were degraded to a very large extent. But the question we have to ask is, with all these 10 years of counter-terrorism, what has happened within the Sahel areas? Really, you would notice that our approach has actually been to killing terrorists, but not to killing terrorism. Because in order for us to achieve the success that we want, because I will ask, what can we account for the past 10 years of kinetic counter-terrorism operation in the Sahel? Have we achieved the needed results? With the killing of the terrorist group and their leaders, have you yielded the positive results? And so there are quite a number of challenges that try to affect this. But regionals and even the countries themselves, the armies of Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, they've done a great deal of work just to degrade the capacities of these groups. There are limitations in this country by themselves. There have been regional efforts. We know of the Accra Initiative. We know of the OGS Accord. We know of G5 Sahel, MNJTF. We know of AFISMA, which now led to MINISMA in Mali. And then even in recent times, in 2022, the African Union has even taken a number of decisions just to ensure that the counter-terrorism effort in Sahel is sustained and to ensure there is peace and security in the region. But really, with all these efforts, the threats continue to persist. So the question is why? Please, next slide. I know Mary will be giving me times very soon. So that's what have been the challenges. Indeed, I look at the challenges in the broad way of issues. It's about issues of coordination and cooperation. One thing that we have to get in mind is that even when Barkhane was in Sahel, some of the national countries complain about lack of cooperation, because you could notice that the foreign troops that are operating sometime in the same theater with the national troops, issues of cooperation and ability to share actionable intelligence to actually counter attacks were not that much there. And then this counter-terrorism has also led to issues of securitization in the Sahel region. Always we think about, and then boom, we send soldiers into the Sahel. But really, like I mentioned initially, if we are using bullets and guns, it will kill terrorists, all right. But what we intend to kill terrorism in the Sahel is about blending the issues of development and issues of a military approach so that we can solve the problem as a whole. So really, if we intend, and moving forward, maybe in the question and answer session, I believe those issues will come out. But of course, a lot have been done, but a lot more needs to be done. So we probably may want to change our approach and ensuring that there was a blend of human security response approach by addressing the vulnerabilities of people in the Sahel, by taking into consideration their vulnerabilities, by taking into consideration the economic situation and how best we could be able to support, especially young people, to come out of economic circumstances that allow them to be vulnerable to violent extremist recruitment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you for this very interesting overview of the security initiatives in the Sahel. I know you had much more to share, but we're also having a Q&A at the end to further expand on some of the points that you've made and the outcomes and limitations of the approach that have been undertaken so far in the region. But for now, let's hear a bit more about European and international initiatives in Niger in particular with Delina. So please, Delina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Meryl. And perhaps if you could put on a map, I think that'd be nice for just people to follow in there as well. I don't have any slides and I will be very brief for everybody's joy. So I will share a little bit on Niger because I'm based here, but also because I want to give a bit of a photography of what Barkhane will meet as it moves closer to us here. So I'm zooming in compared to what Richard presented. I'm zooming in onto Niger and onto Barkhane itself. So on this redeployment of transformed Barkhane to Niger, of course, what is happening in Mali, what has happened in Mali has obviously had reverberations here as well. Now, the theater for Barkhane operations remains as vast as it once was, but the combat zones have been reduced. So French soldiers are being repositioned. They now will be divided between Niger, which will host about 18,000 soldiers, much more than the 1,000 which were stationed in Niamey and elsewhere in the country until now, and also Chad, which will have about 1,000. The operation Barkhane, I mean, again, names will change, and some of it will also change. But the operation still remains a counter-terrorism one. And I'm quoting here Barkhane General Baratz, who said, "We are not substituting ourselves to our partners." So this is supposedly the biggest change that is occurring within Barkhane. The French army, again, I'm quoting, will no longer wants to be exposed. It is no longer a question of fighting a war, but of enabling them, in this case, of course, Nigerian/Sahelian armies, to win theirs. So to accommodate some of these men, the French army is building a new infrastructure in general across the country, specifically in a place called Ayoru, which is 15 kilometers from the border with Mali, not far from the Niger camp of Walam, where Nigerian soldiers are stationed, and especially from the Kandaji Dam project. And I want to mention this dam because it's becoming a very central topic of conversation here. The dam is very vital for the country's economy. Works around the dam have been stopped a number of times, and they have restarted a number of times. And this joint armed post will soon be operational. And again, it is not a French camp. It is not considered a French camp, but a Nigerian one. Let's look now at what could be happening soon. So while Barkhane would provide better security to the Garde Nationale, which is one part of the Nigerian defense and security forces, and the Garde Nationale, we all know, is currently struggling in Tillabéri, around Tillabéri, in some cases as far as 40 kilometers from Niamey, the capital of Niger, and also Tawa. It also means that every failure on the part of the French will be badly perceived in those areas should they fail to protect civilians, despite their mission, once again, being of a different nature. So Barkhane is not there to protect civilians, it is there to conduct a counter-terrorism operation. Niger's President Bazoum, it is not just pursuing a military strategy. He's tackling the issue of insecurity. So we've looked at what Barkhane is doing in Niger now. Let's look at what is happening in the country proper. How is the government reacting to this? What did the government want? What does the government want from this? So he's tackling the issue of insecurity from a variety of angles. He is negotiating with armed groups through a three-tier strategy. He is seeking to build better community cohesion programs, not just in areas touched by violence, but also in areas which have a potential for being targeted in the future, such as, for example, Maradi, where banditism and kidnappings are on the rise. Another novel strategy, and this is extraordinary. I mean, I think this is the most interesting development in the country currently, although success levels will not be as great as they are currently depicted. But another novel strategy employed by the Nigerian government is that of the so-called Reintegration Centers for former combatants. There was one that was launched a few years back in Gudumaria in the south for former Boko Haram fighters, which would be, and I'm quoting here, de-radicalized and then professionalized so that they can find jobs after this period with Boko Haram. The example of Gudumaria wasn't very successful. And despite this, the government has launched something very similar, but even more ambitious. In Tillabéri, it has launched, is inaugurated this new center called Hamdalaye, which is supposed to reintegrate, de-radicalize and integrate into the Nigerian army former Islamic State in the Sahel fighters. So this will be a development for all European states to watch, especially for France. So despite what, and the Americans, obviously. So despite what Bazoum said in a May, in an interview, I think it was in May, he said, "I don't want to insult my army. That's why I won't hire the services of Europeans to wage war in our place. Still, I believe," and I'm going back to the main point of this presentation, "I believe it will be a hard sell for civilians in villages along the border with Mali and with Burkina to see it this way. Every failure of Barkhane and the Garde Nationale and the Nigerian Defense and Security Forces will be even heavier now that all of the European forces will be based here." This also means, however, the fact that Bazoum believes in the strategy where it is his army fighting on the front lines, this also means that he sees no future for Wagner, which is, we know, a Russian paramilitary group that was recently called in Mali and Burkina. He sees no future for Wagner in Niger, which I would say, again, is the only good news. The Nigerian government doesn't have a big interest in having Wagner here. And I mean, I suppose one big reason for this is that all of the EU's security and bilateral aid will fall back in the coming months and years here in Niger. So there is a strong interest on the part of the Nigerian government and Nigerian elites to take all of this. And it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. It's better to let Wagner operate where it is operating already. But the fact that Chad, Burkina and Mali are not viable options for European partners to trust, with a small exception for Chad, also means that Niger and Bazoum, and this is my second main point, have incredible negotiating power vis-a-vis their allies. And I think Europeans, not just Paris, but Berlin, Rome, Brussels, also London, should be very, very aware of this, should be very aware that Bazoum right now can ask for what he wants. I just want to mention because Richard talked about regional efforts as well, and I think it's worth talking about this. I'm afraid to say that the joint force in Niger, but frankly also elsewhere in the region, doesn't feature as a relevant topic of discussion within Nigerian army circles, and doesn't seem to be something the government was even ever counting on. I don't believe this was based only on the fact that there was external dependency on the joint force, but rather on the lack of trust between Sahelian governments and ministries themselves. I mean, it's much more of a Sahelian problem, I find, rather than something that Europeans contributed to creating. So voilà, I think, I mean, this was an overview of Niger and future Barkhane developments. I hope this was useful. I'm here for any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Delina. Thank you for this indeed overview of the situation in Niger and some of the new developments, and also I think perceptions of these developments were really interesting. I'm sure everyone has a lot of questions, so please do not hesitate to submit them. And in the meantime, we will now conclude with the presentations with Andrew to reflect on some of the recent trends in the region, and then particularly the new actors that have emerged throughout the years in the Sahel. So please, Andrew, feel free to start.
Great. Well, thank you, Mel. Thank you, ICCT, and to the colleagues for such excellent presentations. I've been asked to speak about political dynamics, the evolution of dynamics, and particularly the sort of new external actors, and then some of the impact that that's had on the security situation. And I'll reflect a bit at the end about the security situation and how it has evolved since the French withdrawal from Mali. And I think the first thing to note about this is that, first of all, there's been a general, degradation of political environments in the Sahel. This is related in Mali and Burkina Faso, particularly to the coups that have happened over the past several years. But also Niger has faced repeated issues, not just of coups and the threat of disruption of democratic rule, but an increasingly authoritarian political environment and increasing pressure on civil society over the last several years, particularly when raising questions about government conduct and how budgets are managed and how the fight against terrorism has been managed. And this is playing out differently in each Sahelian country, but it is a significant factor. And it's something that also has an impact on not just relations to civilians and the sort of general environment in these countries, but also has an impact to how the international community relates to the region. And it's something that's going to continue to be important in the future. But so moving toward this question in particular of the geopolitical environment and new security partners, this is somewhat of an obsession, I think, for Europeans in particular, but also for the United States, and has led some people to talk about things like a new Cold War or new eras of geopolitical competition in the region. But the first thing to note is that while these partnerships have evolved over time, when we're looking particularly really at China, Turkey, and Russia, none of these countries are particularly new to the region, though with Turkey it's a bit different. But China and the Soviet Union were very important military and economic partners for Sahelian states during the Cold War period and after. And China has established really significant industrial, economic, and political ties in the region. And they've also contributed a significant number of troops to MINUSMA, to the UN force in Mali. And one of the things I want to emphasize also is that the arrival of security actors, these are not just security actors. So looking at these three countries in particular, Russia is much more focused on security engagement, security issues, but all of them have been involved to some extent in economic ventures. Turkey and China, particularly in some development and some other work in mining and other industries. And then the security component is one part of this. Again, it's more significant for Russia, and I'll talk about that last as a result. But so shifting to Turkey and Russia, where they've increased their involvement in recent years, Turkey, especially since 2005, which was declared the Year of Africa, and then 2010, where embassies started opening in Bamako and then Ouagadougou and Niamey, there has been a much more significant diplomatic as well as economic presence in the region. And then Russian involvement has focused much more significantly on training equipment and also political engagement, particularly after 2017 and 2018. And so in each of these cases, we see engagement driven by very explicit political decisions taken by the leadership of these countries for increased involvement in Africa and in the Sahel in particular. But with some significant differences between them. But in different ways, each of these countries has presented itself internationally, as well as to Sahelian and to other African partners, as an explicit alternative to Europe and the United States, and have offered different and alternative models of engagement. So looking at Turkey, Turkish engagement has focused on a number of areas, particularly what's often described as soft power. So economic ties, but also cultural efforts like mosque construction, the renovation of heritage sites, and more explicitly since 2016 in the attempted coup in Turkey, the takeover and management of schools formerly run by the Gulen, by followers of Fethullah Gulen, as well as humanitarian aid and NGO activities, especially in Niger. And this is an interesting case where, as Delina also talked about, Niger has become such a focal point for international engagement, and not just French, European, and American engagement, but is also a central node for Turkish engagement in the region. And Turkey, in Niger, but also elsewhere, has increased its industrial production and construction efforts, again, particularly in Niger, but across the region. They've also increased their involvement in security affairs. In particular, Turkey has pledged $5 million to the G5 Sahel, $5 million, and conducted some limited partnership and training programs for Sahelian security forces. They've also signed security partnerships with Niger and Burkina Faso, and Niger, Burkina Faso, and most recently Mali now all operate Turkish drones. Turkey is also involved in selling munitions and some small arms in the region. But these security commitments are much, much smaller than Turkish engagement in Libya and Somalia, for instance, and its economic engagement is much smaller than in countries like Algeria. So we have to keep, I think, some perspective on this and some perspective on how this engagement is organized and to what end. Now, moving to Russia, as I said, Russia has been a persistent partner and particularly weapons supplier and trainer in Africa, including in Sahel, but with a much more sustained engagement over the last 5 years. This has included, on the one hand, increased political engagement with Sahelian governments, and particularly trying to take a different approach and a markedly different approach toward transitional governments, really coup governments in Mali and Burkina Faso than those taken by France or the United States. But this engagement has more recently focused particularly on the involvement, on Russian government involvement, or the alleged government involvement in the spread of misinformation and disinformation in the Sahel, support to civil society actors who've pushed very vocally for the withdrawal of French forces from the Sahel, And then, of course, the presence of the Wagner Group in Mali, and then potentially, according to some reports, in Burkina Faso. On disinformation, I'll say very quickly, there's a tendency sometimes in Europe, particularly in France, but also in the United States, to attribute all anti-European or anti-Western sentiment to this active disinformation campaign. And certainly there is an active campaign that is underway, but the civil society support for some of these initiatives and for particularly for either the withdrawal of French forces or opposition to France, to European policy, is not just a result of Russian disinformation, Russian efforts. And I think it's very important that we not reduce everything that happens in the region to a kind of external geopolitical competition that's then imposed on the Sahel. There's certainly a level of geopolitical competition. There are certainly a number of external factors and external influences that impact the region very significantly, but we really have to keep the regional context in mind and the local context in mind when trying to understand and then address what is happening in the region right now. That said, the security situation in the Sahel continues to evolve very dramatically, and the arrival of the Wagner Group in Mali, as well as the withdrawal of French forces, the political turmoil caused by the coups in Mali and Burkina Faso, have all had a very, very significant impact on the security situation in Mali, and then also in the broader region. And this is the map that we have up, using data from ACLED, really demonstrates just the spread of the attacks that Richard also talked about, and how they're organized regionally. And so the first thing that we can say is that when looking at the Wagner Group, the Wagner Group did not start the violence in central Mali, where they've been particularly active. They did not start the process of a kind of communitarization of violence in central Mali that preceded their arrival by several years. But what we can say is that Russian operations, particularly those in conjunction with Malian armed forces and with militia forces, has contributed significantly to not just a degradation of the security environment, but particularly to the targeting of civilians as a result of these operations. Now, again, this is something that has been a feature of conflict in central Mali for several years, including massacres against civilians committed by government forces or government-aligned forces in some cases, and also by jihadist groups to a lesser extent. But several of the incidents that we've seen since the arrival of Russian forces or Wagner Group forces, and conducted partially or almost exclusively by these Russian forces, have led to a kind of dramatic escalation in several cases of that violence in ways that we've not seen before in the Sahel. These operations have also led to not just a number of incidents of killing, but also reported torture camps or camps where those arrested are tortured and interrogated, and also an increase in the theft of cattle and other goods, in addition to these large-scale massacres and other killings. And so, again, the Russian involvement there has really exacerbated this conflict that was underway, and also led in part to an intensification of JNIM violence against civilians, particularly in Banjagara and Bankas toward the border with Burkina Faso. It's also led in several cases to the disruption of these, what are sometimes referred to as local peace agreements. Really, they're survival agreements between local communities and armed groups, particularly JNIM, and has led to a really significant increase in pressure on civilians as a result. And JNIM, for instance, has in several cases enforced much harsher conditions on communities following the disruption of these accords and following Russian and militia security operations in central Mali. Another aspect of the security situation that has really come on strongly since the French withdrawal is the rapid return to power of Islamic State-aligned forces in Menaka and Gao, and their spread into the Liptako Gorma, or back into parts of the Liptako Gorma. So this has led to a really significant number of civilians killed, the widespread theft of cattle and other goods, and economic pressure on civilians, and also the large-scale displacement of targeted populations in these regions. It's also led to a return of open conflict, which had sort of been simmering for a bit, between Islamic State-aligned forces and JNIM, again, with civilians caught on the crossfire by both groups. There are also, of course, Wagner forces present in Menaka and Timbuktu, some reportedly in Gao, but with very little impact so far on the security situation. And so despite the assertions of the Malian government, we're now looking at a situation where really much of the country is out of the control of government forces. And as attacks have continued to spread south in Mali, we are now seeing a case where Bamako, the capital, especially recently, both in the last 6 months and really in the last couple of weeks, has been increasingly targeted. The outlying areas up to about sort of an hour and a half outside of Bamako have increasingly been targeted by attacks on security and police posts in ways that seem designed to both demonstrate force, but also demonstrate an encirclement of the capital itself, which is a major risk factor. And then very briefly, as we can see on the map, the spread of these attacks, particularly JNIM attacks across the region, has also led to really, really significant losses of territory in Burkina Faso, and similar approaches potentially to what's happened in Mali in some cases, particularly the reliance on auxiliary forces, militia forces, which in Burkina Faso are VDP, the Volonté pour la Défense de la Patrie, that has accelerated after the most recent coup in Burkina Faso, and again, takes not only a very significant toll on civilians, but exacerbates many of the existing conflict dynamics on both sides. So again, putting significant pressure on civilians, but also acting as a radicalizing factor in terms of the modes of violence exercised by jihadist groups. And these are all very significant sources of concern for the region, particularly as attacks have continued to spread toward the littoral states, but also continue to threaten Niger. And so the political and the security situation also for Niger, even if it's very different from Mali and Burkina Faso, and the government has handled this very differently in those countries, still poses an enormous risk to the stability in coming years of Niger. And I'll stop there, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you to all of the speakers for these very interesting presentation and all of these insights. I will open now the Q&A session. I see that we already have a few questions in the chat, but maybe just the first question on my side. I think what clearly appeared from all of your remarks is the great number of actors that have been involved in the Sahel crisis over the years, the number of organizations involved, strategies that have been developed, and initiatives. And I know, Richard, you mentioned the issue of coordination, and I was wondering if you could tell us more about what this multiplicity of actors, how it has impacted the response that have been put in practice in the Sahel, whether there have been enough coordination, and if not, what should be done to rationalize these efforts and ensure better coordination. What organization, for example, would be best placed to take the lead in that regard?
Okay, Meryl, thank you very much about your question. I mean, with respect to issues of coordination and cooperation, I'm pretty sure that if you are somebody on the ground, these are issues that will come time. But I would even pose the question, if, for example, you have moved from another continent and your main purpose is to fight terrorism and violent extremism in the Sahel, and we cannot collaborate with the security agencies on the ground, whose country we are trying to ensure peace, then what will we be doing? Because we have had cases where national armies of Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso have said that Their intelligence could even tell them that there was going to be a terrorist attack where they have called on some of these foreign forces. The forces respond only after the attacks have taken place. And issue of sharing intelligence between these local armies and the foreign troops have also been raised a number of times. And so my point is, if our aim is to work towards ensuring peace and security in the countries where we have been deployed to, and we cannot collaborate with the locals, we cannot achieve anything. Because personally, I think that given the opportunities, these local armies have the capacity to ensure that there was peace and stability in their countries. And it's important that we give them that credit because they live in the countries, they know the people, and they know the people better. So any foreign force that is coming in and will not be able to be in a position to share intelligence with the locals and to be able to cooperate with the locals. Look, even in areas where foreign troops are supposed to be in the same theater with local troops, we have had challenges of collaboration. And here I must also ask that even among countries of the Sahel, we seem to have pockets of some of these issues. But I can tell you that over time, with initiatives such as Accra Initiative coming on board, we have seen how countries in the Sahel have been able to collaborate more among themselves to share intelligence among the countries, either to disrupt financing of terrorism, either to disrupt organized crime networks that facilitate terrorism activities, or either to launch an attacks on terrorist hideouts to prevent them from carrying attack. So really, I personally believe in what I call the local solution to the local problem. And I believe the sub-region of which the Sahel fall actually have enough mechanism to actually provide these issues of cooperation and collaboration. Look, the Sahel or the Barkhane has not been the only deployment in the Sahel, but let's go to our own Lake Chad Basin and look at what the MNJTF has done. If we have followed the trajectory in the Lake Chad Basin, you could realize that attacks in the Lake Chad Basin around the Chad area, the Cameroon Far North area, and then the Borno and even the Yobo area of Nigeria have reduced considerably. And this has been a collaborative work between the National Army of Nigeria, Chad, Niger, and Cameroon. They have achieved some successes among themselves. And so these African countries, given the necessary resources, they would have the right platform to share intelligence among themselves. So really, if a foreign forces is coming in, I believe that the local armies will have to have a bigger say in what activities are done. Because really, I can say that no importation of foreign strategy in the Sahel would work. The solution to the problem in the Sahel is with the Sahel countries. And I believe that they know what it takes to actually degrade what the terrorist groups are doing. You could see that during the within the early part of this year, when this whole hula baloo about exit of Barkhane happens and all that, Mali intensified its counter-terrorism operation. But of course, we have to know that the country has its own limitations because the problem that confronts Mali are enormous. The problem are not just only violent extremism and terrorism. It may be one of them, but it has humanitarian crisis to deal with. It has economic condition to deal with. But I can tell you that the young people of Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, have the resolve to actually ensure that their countries are stabilized. Just as any young person in West Africa is interested in ensuring that there's peace and security there. So I believe that when these forces come in, the local dynamics should be very important to them and to ensure that the collaboration and the respect and the mutual understanding of what is needed to address the threats, it's actually well coordinated.
Thank you very much, Richard. Well noted. More focus should be placed on the locals. And
can I just come in quickly on this, Mary? I don't know whether you want to be in as well, but it's a very general question, and I think it makes sense for us all to address it. Sure. I mean, what Richard is saying, of course, the local solution, of course, Sahelian armies should be the ones responsible for all of this. I think there is a bit of an illness. There is an illness of Europeans, Americans, and Sahelians as well, which is the complete lack of political and military will to risk. No one is present in these areas. I mean, sure, the collaboration on the Lake Chad Basin has yielded some positive results in the past, but what is happening in the Liptako-Gourma is that the Malian side of things, also the Nigerian side of the border, I mean, as far as 15 kilometers on each side of the border, is completely empty. There's no one that is willing to go, aside from self-defense militia, which are another problem. I mean, a whole array of things. So something that we see quite a lot from European capitals. And I speak to this because I was based in Brussels for 6 years. And in Brussels, we talk about initiatives and we talk about new efforts and we discuss the compliance framework. And it all looks very nice and polished and it looks like it can work. And in theory can. The joint force in theory is a brilliant idea. In 2017, great. The problem is that none of that was actually truly applied here. People are terrified. The military are terrified. I mean, after attacks in Niger, in Chinagodrar, there is complete void. And so I understand that Europeans should risk as much as they are risking now, because this is not, again, a European war to wage. But I don't think that the issue is being perceived very different in the Sahel, or at least the reaction isn't very different. Of course, it is much more crucial for Sahelian governments to tackle this. But the instruments that are being used and the political willingness, it's not a lot.
I'd like to just add very quickly to build on that. I think doing this is exactly right. And there's a strange disconnect between the level of threat that's facing Sahelian countries, and also even sometimes the ways that Europeans talk about this, and then the actual commitment, not in terms of money, because there's significant amounts of money that have been spent, but in terms of a kind of real long-term strategy for the region that's lacking. And one of the hallmarks of this is also that for years, as insecurity spread in the Sahel, there was such a tendency for a long time to be in denial about the actual causes of the spreading militancy, with first in Mali and Burkina Faso and also in Niger, a tendency for a long time to say, well, this is an external problem that has arrived in our country, but it's not really due to any of the context here. This was the refrain in Mali for years before 2012. It was the refrain partially in Burkina Faso, and it certainly is something that is a very common statement in Niger, that these problems come from Mali, they come from the other sides of the border. And this really misses the point. And so there's still, even as mentalities have changed and evolved in the Sahel and in Europe, we're still lagging. And particularly in terms of the European response and the American response, there's such a lengthy process of discussion and program and project formulation that by the time anything can get underway, the situation has already changed completely. And so in some ways, at least for the international community, we're still investing in the wrong areas and not investing in the kind of capacity building, both for our own diplomatic security cooperation side and also capacity building in the region that might be able to start making more of a difference.
Thanks all, and of course, feel free to jump in. I will just follow up on something that you just mentioned, Andrew. The fact that the threat is always perceived, at least initially, as something coming from abroad. We have some questions in the chat about the coastal states. I think that's something that you've mentioned in different presentations. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about what kind of lessons we should learn from the Sahel that would be particularly salient for the coastal West African states, and how we can avoid a similar scenario as what we've seen in Mali or in other Sahelian states. maybe Andrew,
Well,
you can start, and then yeah.
Sure. So I think one of the interesting things about this is that the coastal states and also the international community have both tried to approach these responses from the perspective that initiatives in the Sahel have failed. And so Europeans will speak about a much lighter footprint, a much less overt military presence in the coastal states, supporting African initiatives, particularly the Accra initiative. And coastal West African states also speak in similar terms, but also in terms of trying to learn some of the lessons about working with external partners, outsourcing security to external partners and militias in particular. This has worked, I think, for now, a bit better in Côte d'Ivoire than it has in Benin or Togo, or even we're starting to see more indications, I think, in northern Ghana of potential problems that haven't been handled quite as well, and particularly the outreach to local communities that are targeted for recruitment by jihadist groups. Even though the social and historical context is different in the coastal states, we haven't quite seen the same efforts to really protect civilians in some of these cases as we should have. And so this is, I think, one of the really important lessons of the Sahel is the need not necessarily to focus on services, service provision, but really access to justice and government protection of civilians. And that's something that if there's a lesson to be learned from the Sahel, I think that is one of them, particularly if we're looking more at a preventative phase rather than a kind of active, intense insurgency in the coastal states. That's where many of our efforts should be focused.
Thank you. I think, Richard, you wanted to jump in, or not?
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that Andres have said basically what I wanted to say. I think what I would want to add is that it is important for each coastal state to identify their own vulnerabilities and grievances, because all these countries have their local context-specific grievances and vulnerabilities. And like Andres mentioned, there are basically two solutions to addressing violent extremism and terrorism. One, it's about prevention or pursuing. But immediately you move to pursuing terrorist and violent extremist groups, it means that your preventative approach has failed. And what we have to know is that it is more expensive to pursue than to prevent. If you spend $1 on any activity to prevent, you end up spending $4 to pursue. The implication is that if prevention will cost us $1 million, pursuing them will cost us $4 million, and it may not yield the necessary results. And so the lesson coastal states will have to learn from what is happening in the Sahel is to put in more efforts in prevention. In prevention here, like you mentioned, access to justice, because injustice, marginalization, and discrimination are all root causes that tend to favor the recruitment and festering of terrorism and violent extremism. We are talking about unemployment, the gap between the South and the North, the living condition among the bordering communities, and the local context-specific grievances, issues of transhumance. These issues, when not well handled, would actually begin to come as the local grievances that extremists can rely on. And so these countries will have to ensure that they are on the path of achieving community resilience within their vulnerable communities. And I believe that when these are done, extremist groups may not be able to find their ways. I have done some work along the border communities of Ghana to the, Togo and even to Burkina Faso. There are some characteristics we cannot say that it's favorable, and there are some characteristics you could say that it's favorable. And so that's Togo, Benin, Burkina Faso, and Cote d'Ivoire are able to do their local context-specific risk analysis. They will know which factors to tackle and which factors they can easily addressed with preventative approach. And so really, I think the focus will have to be on preventions, and more effort will have to be put on that to ensure that the entire countries, the communities, the local communities, the people, young people, women groups are well abreast with the issues when it comes to terrorism and violent extremisms.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. I'm going to move to another question. We have a lot of questions in the chat on the Niger situation in particular, for you, Delina, particularly. First, a question about the rehabilitation and reintegration program that you discussed, and whether there are any evaluations that have been conducted already, if any results can be seen. And maybe I'll add the second question on Niger, so you can answer both. One of the big question around Niger, I guess, with some of you mentioning that it has become a hub, a new privileged partner for many actors. So participants are asking, why does Niger stand out? Is there hope that counterterrorism approaches are going to work better in Niger?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Meryl. And thank you to Aileen for the question on evaluation. When evaluations are well done, I'm a big fan. So this is something that we talk about often with Andrew and with other analysts as well. So there has been an evaluation being done on Gudu Maria. It was something that was commissioned to the PNUD is the UNDP. UNDP was in charge of the center itself. So actually they were involved in building the center, and then they are the ones that commissioned the evaluation. You can understand that there is a bit of a conflict of interest there. And this is something that tends to happen quite often here. It's that there's very few organizations that are independent, very few academics also. I mean, there is a plethora of academics working on the Sahel, but very few academics that are employed to do these evaluations, and academics, of course, in this case, and I don't want to, I mean, I'm talking about us here, but they are supposedly the ones that are independent enough and able enough to do this in a way that is as trustworthy and ethically proper as possible. One problem is not just the fact that independent research is not commissioned, is also the fact that when this is done, it's very difficult for researchers to go to these places. And so you need someone that knows the context really well. And so that truly has been working on the Sahel region for a number of years. I mean, if you call Deloitte and ask them to go into Gudu Maria for 2 weeks, you can imagine that the evaluation is not going to be good enough. But the problem is that the Nigerian state and European states themselves, and also Nigerian staff and European staff, is very complex for everyone to go to these places. And so obviously, the thing I was mentioning before about risk-taking is something that happens in research as well. We don't know what's going on in a lot of these places, and people in these places have to go through intermediary after intermediary to be able to give their version of the facts. And that incurs into a broken telephone type scheme, right? Where you don't exactly know who gave the information first and how. There is a lot to say about this. To go back to the Gudu Maria issue, there is no proper independent evaluation unless it is something done by academics out of their own accord. So there is a researcher in my university here in Niamey who is currently doing work on Boko Haram in Gudu Maria. We are just hoping that a proper evaluation will be done for Hamdallaye, this center in Tillaberi. Thank you for the question. And if you want, I can keep you updated on this. Then the other question you mentioned, Meryl, was...
Yeah, sorry, just a question about why Niger now stands out as, the privileged partner for many.
Yeah, so, I mean, formally, Niger is not a military dictatorship. So the elections were legitimate. To a large extent in the country. the Bazoum government and the government before that of Bazoum, which is part of the same party, had very good relations with most European and the US. So this depends on the fact that formally, of course, to engage in a country as Europeans, this is much easier if you can say that the state you're partnering up with is a legitimate one. I think this is the only reason. On the strategy of the Nigerian state, they call it stabilization strategy, yeah? So it's the thing I was mentioning before, negotiations with armed groups, this whole community cohesion programs, and the military strategy. I think there is a lot to be done there. I mean, not on the military strategy side of things, because again, unwillingness to risk on the part of everyone. But on the negotiations with armed groups, we are seeing some results. I mean, for a few months, and now it's tense again, but for a few months in certain areas of Tillabéri and Tawa, some of the violence had frozen. And this, we believe, is due to the fact that this Bazoum strategy, which is a complex one, seems to be working, at least in terms of localized ceasefires. This is an interesting thing to watch and support.
Yeah, thank you very much. And just following up on that, we have a question also on negotiations and whether you think negotiations with terrorist groups have a future in the Sahel, as it is phrased. I would be curious to hear your perspectives on that, and also if there's main differences between the different countries' approaches to this. Yeah, Andrew, do you want to? Okay.
Yeah, well, so there are a couple of different issues to keep in mind, and there are a couple of different kinds of negotiations. So I'm working on, hopefully finishing soon, a paper on these negotiations in Central Mali, actually, and those are very different than when we're talking about like national level negotiations. So on the one hand, you have either communal engagements that are taken directly between communities and armed groups. You sometimes have agreements directly between armed groups or different members of armed groups. Some of these negotiations, for instance, have excluded commanders who were not in favor of those negotiations. Then you have also talks between the state and communities, the state and armed groups, but on a local level or in a localized level, or sort of state-supported negotiations between communities and armed groups, as has happened in a couple of cases in Mali. And then you have different kinds of mediation efforts, for instance, to try to lift the blockades in places like Djibo and Burkina Faso. And then you have direct state talks with armed groups. So you have, for instance, in Niger, you have regular and open communication and different channels of communication, some of them more overt than others, between the government and armed groups. And then in Mali, for several years, going back especially multiple times in national conferences in Mali, you have this discussion or expression of support for a national negotiation with jihadist groups. So there's a lot of discussion about negotiation. And even, for instance, it was widely known in the region, I think even made public at one point, that basically France had said that it was opposed to direct negotiations with jihadist leaders, not necessarily even with the groups themselves, because France in particular has often made a distinction between the leadership of these groups, which they see as connected to global jihadist organizations, and the fighters for these groups. So there's a regular discussion of negotiations. There are multiple ways of conducting those negotiations. There are also, there's a bit more of an, not quite appetite for it, but a bit more openness to that in different forms, even in the international community, than is sometimes acknowledged. All of that being said, the challenge of negotiations is, particularly on a national level, is, first of all, who do you talk with? So there have been attempts, for instance, in Mali to negotiate with Amadou Koufa in central Mali, where he's always referred that to his hierarchy within JNM and to Yadakali. And then there's also the question of what is the end goal of negotiations. So the question is often framed in terms of, can you negotiate? And that's not the question to be asking. The question to be asking is, what are you negotiating for? And what are you negotiating about? And so I think the challenge for Sahelian governments in trying to formulate these negotiations or conduct them is not that they can't take place over certain issues. It's that the militant groups in question either sometimes are simply not in favor of those negotiations. This has been the case with the Islamic State, for instance, where they've engaged in certain talks with Niger's government, but also just rejected them at other times. And then the fact that these groups are largely in a position of strength. And so the kinds of terms that they might accept, or the kinds of conditions that they might impose, are unacceptable, or would be unacceptable to any Sahelian government right now, particularly if they were conducted publicly. And in the case of the more localized agreements, there is a real possibility. There's quite a model for those local agreements in central Mali, in parts of northern Mali, in parts of Burkina Faso, particularly where they're conducted by communal and religious leaders. At the same time, those accords are often very difficult to enforce. They're often very tenuous, very fragile. And because they're so localized and because they take different forms in different areas, it's very hard to say, even when they're supported by NGOs, how they will continue, how those accords will be enforced in the future, and who's actually responsible for them. Because at the end of the day, when you're talking about armed groups, there's still the question of who has weapons, who is willing to use violence, and under what conditions. And so these accords are both fragile, and they are either often enforced or forced on communities by armed groups, or they take place in a context and an environment of violence and threat and pressure. So that's why I say these aren't really peace accords. None of them are really peace accords. Because first of all, it's temporary and there's not really a larger process for the localized negotiations. And when there is, it's very ad hoc, very subject to change, and often has the effect of actually weakening the state and further solidifying the presence of armed groups in these areas. So yes, negotiations are theoretically possible. They are already happening in Sahel in many different forms. But I don't think we can say that they've had much of a positive impact, except in some areas where they've been able to temporarily reduce violence. But again, the constraints on these accords and the constraints of the context make those, even those periods of temporary calm, very tenuous and often quite fleeting.
Thank you very much. I don't know if anyone wanted to add on that. Otherwise, given the time, I'll just ask a very last question and ask you to be brief in your answers if possible, because we're going to finish this webinar soon. But I was wondering, to conclude with this whole discussion, what can civil society actors or researchers the types of organizations we've worked with can do to help advance efforts in the Sahel? What should be the priorities for the practitioners, but maybe also including the donor community?
Shall I very quickly? Thank you. Donors, it's connected. Donors should be directly funding Sahelian civil society. This is something that we're forgetting quite often from European capitals, and especially from Brussels, actually, which is, potentially, I think Europe and European member states are the biggest donors. There is a lot of local civil society here. The landscape is varied, very vivacious. There is a lot going on in small initiatives, but the amount of funding that they receive is always being filtered through UN agencies, international NGOs, such as, for example, the Rescue Committee, Search for Common Ground, Save the Children, great organizations. The problem is that the local civil society, they cannot draft their own agenda, right? I mean, if they have to abide by what Save the Children has received as funding and the Save the Children programming, they are unable to do things that they want themselves. So the EU should take, the EU specifically, I think, because France is already doing this on the side, should take the time to examine which civil society is credible, does good work, has been doing good work for a number of years, and finance them directly and give them the freedom to operate in the whole, I'm going to use this buzzword, stabilization, but what I mean is community cohesion, Caravane de Paix. There is a lot of initiatives that could be funded that would be successful, I think, in their own limited, of course, bubble.
Thank you so much to the three of you for taking part in this event and for all of the presentations and the insights you shared. Thank you also to the participants for joining and for the interesting questions that you had. And finally, thanks to the ICCT communications team, which is behind those kind of events and enable us to be able to host these kinds of live briefing. I will leave it there. Just reminding you that there's an online survey for you to get to send us some feedback on the event. That would be super helpful if you can take a few more minutes to complete that. And thank you again. And I hope you enjoyed this webinar as much as I did.